Nancy Pelosi made the kind of mistake that only looks small until the receipts hit the table. She decided to lecture Senator John Kennedy about ethics on live television while her own household fortune, according to the script's framing, had climbed from roughly $3 million to somewhere near $250 million during a career spent at the highest levels of congressional power. She treated Kennedy like a rural punchline, a man of folksy sayings and television sound bites, apparently forgetting that behind the Louisiana drawl was an Oxford-educated lawyer, a former editor of the Virginia Law Review, and a man who had spent decades practicing law before entering the Senate. Kennedy did not interrupt, did not raise his voice, did not perform for the cameras, because the script presents him as something far more dangerous in that room. A lawyer who had already organized the chronology, marked the exhibits, checked the numbers, and waited for the witness to give him the opening he wanted. Pelosi gave him that opening herself by turning a procedural hearing into a personal lecture. And the moment she did, the argument stopped being about abstract ethics rules and became a direct examination of how political power, legislative timing, and enormous family wealth could exist side by side without attracting serious scrutiny. Kennedy took a sip of water, opened the binder in front of him, and reduced the entire confrontation to the question Pelosi did not appear prepared to answer. How does a household go from approximately $3 million to roughly $250 million while one spouse spends decades drawing a government salary? That question hung over a Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee hearing in the Dirksen Senate Office Building, a hearing carrying the dry title Congressional Ethics, Financial Transparency, and the Stock Act, the sort of name that normally guarantees hours of technical language and very little public attention. The political atmosphere behind it, however, was anything but dry, because Americans had spent years watching disclosures from Paul Pelosi's investment activity circulate through social media, tracking accounts, financial apps, and online communities that treated the Pelosi portfolio almost like an unofficial market index. The joke had become poisonous precisely because it was so easy to understand. Ordinary investors were watching the trades of the husband of one of the most powerful lawmakers in Washington and asking whether those trades seemed unusually well-timed around major legislative developments. Pelosi had not been dragged into the room by subpoena in the script. She had accepted an invitation to testify, apparently confident that 4 decades in Washington had prepared her for anything a Senate committee could throw at her. She had survived leadership wars, national crises, impeachment battles, government shutdowns, hostile cable news cycles, and repeated ethics controversies. So a hearing involving John Kennedy probably looked less like danger and more like another Tuesday in a career built on surviving Washington fights. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat with the posture people had come to expect from him, slightly slouched, reading glasses down on his nose, yellow legal pad beside him, thick binder organized into tabs, and none of the visible anxiety of a politician hunting for a viral moment. That calm mattered because the confrontation in the script depends not on shouting, but on contrast. Pelosi arrives carrying the authority of a former speaker, while Kennedy sits almost casually, allowing the weight of documents and chronology to do the work that theatrics usually try to imitate. For the first hour, nothing exploded, and that was exactly what made what followed more effective, because other senators moved through familiar questions about disclosure requirements, enforcement mechanisms, possible reforms to the Stock Act, and whether congressional families should face tighter restrictions on individual stock trading. Pelosi answered with the discipline of someone who had given thousands of public statements, emphasizing that she did not personally execute the trades, that Paul Pelosi managed his investments independently, and that the family complied with disclosure rules required by law. Then Kennedy was recognized, and the hearing stopped sounding like a policy seminar. His first question was deliberately broad. Should members of Congress or their spouses be permitted to trade individual stocks while the member possesses access to non-public legislative information. Pelosi answered with the argument she had used before, defending participation in a free market economy and emphasizing disclosure rather than prohibition, but instead of stopping there, she widened the exchange and attacked the premise behind the hearing itself. She accused Republicans of hypocrisy for praising free markets while demanding restrictions on public officials, dismissed the proceeding as political theater designed for social media, and then made the mistake that changed the temperature in the room by attacking Kennedy personally, reducing his legislative identity to folksy anecdotes and sound bites while contrasting that image with her own record of major legislation and decades of congressional power. It was exactly the sort of answer that sounds dominant when the other person is expected to respond emotionally, because Pelosi was no longer merely defending a policy position. She was declaring that her experience, status, and accomplishments placed her above the ethical lecture Kennedy was attempting to deliver. Kennedy did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction, and when she finished, the silence itself became part of the cross-examination. He thanked her for her candor, acknowledged that he did in fact tell stories, and then turned the metaphor back on her with the warning about people in glass houses throwing rocks before opening the binder to the first transaction. Visa, March 2008. The number was simple enough for anyone watching at home to follow, which was exactly why it was damaging inside the script's argument. Paul Pelosi acquired 5,000 shares of Visa at the IPO price of $44 per share, an allocation Kennedy characterized as unusual and valuable because major IPO pricing is often difficult for ordinary retail investors to access. 2 days later, Visa's stock was trading around $64, giving the position an enormous short-term gain and creating the first piece of a pattern Kennedy intended to lay out not as proof by itself, but as a transaction demanding an explanation. The key was not simply that Paul Pelosi made money, because making money in an IPO is not inherently suspicious. The script's entire accusation turns on what was happening in Congress at the same time, where legislation affecting credit card companies and merchant swipe fees was sitting within the political orbit of Speaker Pelosi. Kennedy's binder therefore did not stop at the trade, because without legislative context, a profitable investment is just a profitable investment. But with legislative context, it becomes the first link in the chain he was preparing to place in front of the cameras. Kennedy moved directly to the Credit Card Fair Fee Act, legislation that could have forced major credit card companies, including Visa, into negotiations over swipe fees and potentially cost the industry billions of dollars. According to the script's chronology, Visa lobbyists had visited Pelosi's office 3 times in the month before the IPO allocation. The legislation never reached the House floor for a vote, and Paul Pelosi held the newly acquired Visa shares while all of this unfolded. Kennedy compressed those facts into a timeline anyone could understand. Lobbying contact, privileged IPO access, rapid profit, and legislation harmful to the company, failing to advance under a speaker who controlled the House agenda. Pelosi responded that the investment had been made through an existing Wells Fargo broker and had been recommended through normal investment channels. But Kennedy immediately separated that answer from the question he was actually asking because the broker's role did not explain what happened to the bill. That distinction was the first real cut of the hearing, and it established the method Kennedy would use for everything that followed. Every time Pelosi answered the investment question, he would return to legislative timing, and every time she emphasized procedure, he would return to the money. Kennedy then moved to the next tab because Visa was not supposed to stand alone, and the entire force of his argument depended on showing that what Pelosi wanted dismissed as one isolated investment coincidence kept reappearing whenever major legislation and major family trades crossed paths. In June 2022, Paul Pelosi exercised call options connected to roughly 20,000 shares of Nvidia, a semiconductor company whose future would be directly affected by federal policy toward domestic chip manufacturing, with the transaction valued somewhere between $1 million and $5 million on the financial disclosures cited in the script. 3 weeks later, the Senate was preparing to vote on the CHIPS and Science Act, a package worth approximately $280 billion, designed in large part to strengthen and subsidize the American semiconductor industry. And Nancy Pelosi was not some distant backbencher learning about the bill from television like everybody else. She was Speaker of the House, publicly supporting the legislation, helping move the political machinery required to pass it, and occupying one of the few positions in Washington where legislative timing was not speculation, but part of the job. Kennedy did not need to shout when he placed those dates side by side, because the accusation was already sitting in the calendar. Semiconductor exposure first, semiconductor subsidies shortly afterward. Pelosi could argue that Paul Pelosi was an experienced investor, and the script allows her to make precisely that defense, but Kennedy's case was not built around the idea that sophisticated investors are forbidden from buying Nvidia. His point was that sophistication becomes harder to use as a complete explanation when profitable trades repeatedly appear close to legislation involving the same sectors in which the household is invested, especially when one member of that household is helping control the legislative calendar. Kennedy produced a timeline his staff had assembled covering major Paul Pelosi trades across roughly 15 years and lined those transactions up against congressional activity, turning what Pelosi wanted treated as separate investments into one continuous pattern. He pointed back to Visa in 2008, then to Apple and Amazon positions around periods of technology regulation, Alphabet call options around antitrust scrutiny, Nvidia around the CHIPS Act, and later AI-related investments appearing near regulatory discussions involving artificial intelligence. Any one transaction could be explained, he conceded, but the argument became more difficult to wave away when the coincidences kept arriving in the same household with almost mechanical regularity. Kennedy's next move was to take the dispute away from partisan language entirely and drag it into performance numbers, because accusations can be called political, while percentages are harder to insult into disappearing. According to the analysis presented in the script, Paul Pelosi's portfolio averaged approximately a 28% annual return across 15 years, a number Kennedy contrasted with the performance of elite hedge fund managers, whom he placed around an 18 to 22% range. That comparison was designed to make ordinary viewers stop thinking about congressional disclosure forms and start thinking about what kind of investing record would be required to compound wealth at that speed for that long. Kennedy emphasized that millions of retail investors were already following Pelosi-related tracking accounts for exactly that reason, not because Paul Pelosi was the most famous investor in America, but because people had begun treating his timing as a signal worth watching. The mockery surrounding those trackers concealed a much more serious public suspicion. Ordinary people were asking whether the family of a congressional leader somehow kept finding the right sectors before Washington moved. Pelosi responded that her husband had been investing for decades and was highly sophisticated, and Kennedy did not dispute the premise because he did not need to. Instead, he sharpened the implication by observing that Paul Pelosi's investment success appeared strongest during Nancy Pelosi's periods of greatest political power, which transformed the defense from an answer into another question. If the trades were entirely independent from congressional work, then Kennedy wanted the audience to consider why the correlation between financial success and legislative influence seemed so convenient. He did not claim that expertise itself was evidence of wrongdoing. The script's attack was narrower and more corrosive, arguing that repeated timing, combined with extraordinary access to political information, made ordinary explanations feel increasingly inadequate. That is when Kennedy stopped talking about individual trades and turned to the number that gave the whole hearing its emotional center, the family's total wealth. He wrote the figures down slowly, beginning with the estimated roughly $3 million household net worth when Nancy Pelosi entered Congress in 1987, and ending with an estimated fortune near $250 million by 2025. In between those numbers sat a congressional salary of about $174,000 per year, rising to roughly $223,000 during her time as Speaker, compensation that is substantial by normal American standards, but nowhere near enough by itself to generate a $250 million household fortune. Kennedy then did the crude arithmetic on purpose, because complicated financial structures can hide behind accounting language, but a lifetime of congressional paychecks cannot. Roughly 38 years multiplied by $174,000 produces only around $6.5 million in gross salary before taxes, living expenses, property costs, children, travel, and every other expense paid by an ordinary household. Even if Pelosi had somehow kept every dollar of congressional salary untouched for almost 4 decades, the gap between that amount and the household fortune described in the script would still be enormous. That gap was where Kennedy wanted to keep the hearing because Pelosi could correctly say that most of the wealth came from Paul Pelosi's businesses and investments, but that answer merely returned the discussion to the very trading pattern he had spent the previous several minutes laying out. Kennedy acknowledged that Paul Pelosi had operated financial leasing services and had been involved in venture capital before Nancy Pelosi became Speaker, but he argued that the household's most spectacular financial expansion occurred during the years when her political influence was at its highest. He framed the relationship brutally. The salary did not explain the wealth, so the investments had to explain the wealth, and once the investments became the explanation, the timing of those investments became impossible to treat as irrelevant. To reinforce the point, Kennedy invoked a comment attributed in the script to real estate investor Grant Cardone, who had joked that Pelosi would need to live for tens of thousands of years to accumulate that level of wealth through congressional salary alone. The line was sarcastic, but the underlying arithmetic was not, and that was why the insult landed harder than a partisan speech. Pelosi repeated that her husband's success was well documented, independent, and rooted in a business career that preceded her rise in congressional leadership, but Kennedy immediately returned to the federal disclosure forms. If Paul Pelosi's assets were part of Nancy Pelosi's household wealth and therefore reported on financial disclosures signed under penalty of perjury, Kennedy argued, then it was too convenient to describe those assets as completely separate whenever questions about political access became uncomfortable. The point was not that marriage automatically turns every spouse's investment into a crime, and the script does not need that argument to make its attack. The point was that Pelosi could not use household assets when reporting wealth and then emotionally distance herself from the same assets when their timing became politically toxic. Kennedy had now built 3 layers on top of one another. First the individual trades, then the pattern across sectors and years, and finally the massive increase in household wealth those investments helped create. With that structure in place, he changed direction again, away from Wall Street and congressional calendars, and toward the city Nancy Pelosi had represented for 4 decades. San Francisco became the next exhibit, not because homelessness or street crime proved anything about stock trading, but because Kennedy wanted to convert a financial ethics argument into a judgment about priorities, public service, and who had actually benefited during Pelosi's long political career. He contrasted the rise in Pelosi household wealth with the deterioration he described across the city, pointing to thousands of homeless residents, open-air drug markets, fentanyl deaths, businesses leaving, retail theft, boarded storefronts, needles on sidewalks, and neighborhoods that residents no longer recognized as the city they had once known. The rhetorical move was unmistakable. While Pelosi's family balance sheet expanded into 9 figures, Kennedy argued the people she had represented for decades were watching parts of San Francisco collapse under problems their government had repeatedly failed to solve. He pushed the contrast even harder by invoking the family vineyard in Napa Valley, worth millions of dollars and producing expensive wine, then placing that image beside residents struggling only a short distance away with homelessness, addiction, crime, and small business closures. Kennedy was no longer merely asking where the money came from. He was asking what 4 decades of political power were worth if the politician became dramatically wealthier, while the people who kept sending her back to Washington believed their own streets were becoming harder to survive. Kennedy then reached into the binder and pulled out something far more personal than a financial disclosure: a handwritten letter from Margaret Chen, a San Francisco small business owner who, according to the script, had operated a flower shop on Clement Street for 22 years before closing it in 2023. Kennedy said she had contacted Pelosi's office 17 times asking for help with crime and homelessness around her store and had received no response. A number he emphasized because it turned the abstract language of constituent service into something brutally measurable. Her final message, as presented in the script, carried the kind of accusation no press secretary could neutralize with policy jargon. She had voted for Pelosi for 2 decades, watched Pelosi's household become wealthier, watched her own business suffer repeated theft, and never received the basic courtesy of a callback. Kennedy did not need to pretend Margaret Chen's ruined flower shop proved insider trading, because that was not the purpose of introducing the letter. The purpose was to force the hearing to confront the distance between the lifestyle of a political dynasty and the daily reality of the people who kept returning that dynasty to office. He placed Pelosi's vineyard in Napa Valley, worth millions and producing expensive wine, beside a constituent who could no longer keep a modest neighborhood flower shop open, and the contrast did the damage without requiring another spreadsheet. Then Kennedy shifted from money to rules because Pelosi had spent decades defending the legitimacy of the systems she helped oversee, and the script's argument was that the Pelosi family repeatedly seemed to experience those systems differently from ordinary Americans. He brought up September 2020, when Pelosi publicly supported strict masking requirements and treated compliance as a matter of life and death, language that carried enormous moral weight during the pandemic. Against that public standard, Kennedy introduced the image of Pelosi inside a San Francisco salon without a mask at a time when salons were restricted, an incident that had already become politically radioactive because the owner had released surveillance footage. Pelosi had called the situation a setup, but Kennedy's framing was mercilessly simple. Whatever explanations followed, the person helping defend the rules was still seen receiving a service that ordinary Californians had been told they could not receive. To Kennedy, that episode was not merely about a mask or a haircut. It was another example of what the script repeatedly portrays as a 2-tier system in which public officials demanded sacrifice while appearing insulated from the consequences imposed on everyone else. He then moved to May 2022 and Paul Pelosi's DUI case, another subject that had nothing to do with Nvidia or Visa directly, but fit the broader accusation Kennedy was constructing about unequal consequences. The script recounts that Paul Pelosi crashed his Porsche into another vehicle in Napa County, recorded a blood alcohol concentration of 0.082, and was described in the California Highway Patrol report as unsteady, with slurred speech and the odor of alcohol. Kennedy emphasized the sentence: 5 days in jail with only part of that time physically served, and noted that Paul Pelosi did not personally attend sentencing because misdemeanor defendants in California could appear through counsel. As a former practicing lawyer, Kennedy framed that outcome against the experience of ordinary defendants, who, in his telling, would never expect the same combination of wealth, legal accommodation, and leniency after a drunken crash causing injury. Again, the script's strategy was accumulation. No single episode carried the entire case, but every episode was made to point toward the same conclusion about access, privilege, and a family living under rules that seemed dramatically less punishing from the inside. From there, Kennedy widened the lens to the Pelosi network itself, mentioning Paul Pelosi Jr., Companies linked to his business career that had faced federal scrutiny, Gavin Newsom's family connection by marriage, and the concentration of political and financial influence surrounding the Pelosi's in California. His language hardened because by this stage he was no longer presenting the family as a collection of unrelated people making unrelated decisions. The script casts him as describing an entrenched political franchise whose name had become intertwined with money, government, and influence across decades. Pelosi finally turned toward the chairman and objected that the hearing had devolved into an attack on her family, but Kennedy immediately reminded her why the exchange had become personal in the first place. She had spent several minutes attacking his character, dismissing his record as folksy anecdotes and sound bites, and portraying herself as too accomplished to be lectured by him, while he had answered not with insults alone, but with documents, dates, transactions, disclosures, photographs, and numbers drawn from the script's evidentiary package. In Kennedy's framing, she had thrown the first stone and then objected when the glass around her own political house began cracking under scrutiny. That was when Kennedy closed the binder, removed his reading glasses, and abandoned the stack of exhibits for Pelosi's own words, particularly her 2021 defense of congressional participation in the stock market. We are a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that. The statement became the organizing principle of his closing argument because Kennedy treated those few words not as an offhand defense of investment freedom, but as an admission of how Washington's ruling class had learned to think about itself. In his interpretation, Pelosi was defending a system where the people writing the rules could invest in industries affected by those rules, receive information and timing unavailable to ordinary workers, and still call the arrangement nothing more than participation in capitalism. Kennedy's answer was that this was not what ordinary Americans meant by a free market, because a market is not truly free when one participant sits inside the building where laws are negotiated while another participant is refreshing headlines from a kitchen table after the decisions have already been made. The issue, as he presented it, was not wealth itself, but whether extraordinary political access had been converted into an advantage that ordinary investors could never legally or practically reproduce. He then walked through the evidence one final time, stripping away every layer of political vocabulary and returning to the sequence he had built from the beginning. Visa stock had been acquired at the IPO price while legislation harmful to Visa failed to advance. Semiconductor exposure had been established shortly before a massive semiconductor package moved through Congress. A long pattern of trades appeared repeatedly close to legislative activity, and the household fortune described in the script had grown from roughly $3 million to around $250 million. Meanwhile, the city Pelosi had represented for 4 decades was portrayed as deteriorating under homelessness, fentanyl deaths, retail crime, business closures, and public disorder, creating the savage contrast at the center of Kennedy's argument. The representative had become dramatically richer, while many of the represented felt dramatically less secure. He added the Salon episode, Paul Pelosi's DUI, and the broader family network not as independent proof of securities violations, but as evidence of what he wanted viewers to recognize as a culture of exemption. By the time he reached the end, Kennedy was no longer asking the audience to judge one stock trade. He was asking them to judge an entire pattern of power. Then came the fox and the hen house, the kind of Louisiana story Pelosi had mocked minutes earlier, and the exact kind of story Kennedy used because it compressed pages of financial disclosures into an image no viewer could misunderstand. The farmer loses chickens night after night, while the fox guarding the hen house keeps producing explanations. Perhaps a hawk, perhaps a storm, perhaps another coincidence. And the farmer keeps accepting those explanations because the fox is smart, experienced, persuasive, and has been guarding the same hen house for years. Eventually, the farmer stops counting missing chickens and starts counting what has accumulated inside the fox's own den. and Kennedy used that shift to summarize the entire hearing without adding another allegation. According to the script, he looked directly at Pelosi and told her that the American people had started counting the eggs, and her den was very, very full. Then he gathered his papers, ended with no further questions, and left Pelosi sitting at the witness table with the cameras fixed on her and the room suddenly silent enough for every second of hesitation to become part of the record. Pelosi sat motionless for several seconds after Kennedy ended, and in the logic of the script, those seconds mattered because they were presented as the first moment all morning when the former speaker appeared to have no prepared path forward. Her chief of staff leaned toward her, the cameras remained fixed on the witness table, and Pelosi finally asked the chairman for a brief recess so she could consult with counsel. The committee granted 10 minutes. Pelosi left the room with her staff, and what had been framed as a temporary pause slowly became something much larger when 10 minutes turned into 30 and 30 turned into an hour. At 12:22 p.m., according to the script, her chief of staff returned to tell the committee that Pelosi would not be coming back that day because she had been unexpectedly taken ill and that written answers would be submitted later. Kennedy was already moving toward the exit when reporters surrounded him, and he answered with the same dry restraint he had used throughout the hearing, saying that back home in Louisiana, you could tell a great deal about someone by whether they stayed in the room when the receipts came out. The clip of Pelosi requesting a recess and failing to return then becomes the ignition point for the script's aftermath, with her office issuing a short statement that night describing the hearing as a coordinated partisan attack while leaving the specific financial questions essentially untouched. The response, as the script emphasizes, did not directly answer the Visa IPO timeline, the Nvidia timing, the gap between congressional salary and estimated household wealth, Margaret Chen's letter, or Kennedy's broader accusation that legislative access and family investing had become too closely intertwined to dismiss casually. That absence of direct answers was portrayed as more damaging than an angry rebuttal because Kennedy's case had been structured around dates and numbers rather than vague accusations, making general denials look increasingly weak against specific claims. Within the narrative provided, public attention intensified, trading trackers exploded in popularity, and the hearing ceased to be treated as a one-day political confrontation and instead became the opening chapter of a much larger legal crisis. What Kennedy had introduced as questions about timing and ethics was now presented by the script as the foundation for federal scrutiny. The script then escalates dramatically, stating that within 72 hours, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal examination of trading patterns involving members of Congress and their immediate families, with particular attention paid to the timing of transactions relative to legislative action. It further claims that Paul Pelosi's broker at Wells Fargo was compelled to produce trading records going back to 2007, transforming the same historical timeline Kennedy had displayed in a hearing room into the subject of a federal document review. By the second week, according to the narrative, the Department of Justice had opened a parallel criminal investigation involving possible wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy, and insider trading, while prosecutors sought calendars, communications, office records, and financial documents. The central question investigators were said to be asking was exactly the one Kennedy had spent the hearing building toward: whether Nancy Pelosi communicated legislative timing or other useful information to her husband before particular trades were executed. In the script's construction, that was the moment the political argument stopped being merely rhetorical and became a legal question with consequences far beyond a hostile committee hearing. The political fallout was written as equally severe, with Democratic leaders choosing carefully worded statements about transparency and accountability while conspicuously avoiding any forceful defense of Pelosi herself. Hakeem Jeffries is portrayed as emphasizing that no member of Congress should be above scrutiny, Steny Hoyer as declining repeated requests for comment, and progressive allies as going silent at the exact moment Pelosi most needed public support. Even Gavin Newsom, described in the script through the Pelosi family connection, issued language about public trust without defending her by name, a political signal that the protection normally surrounding powerful figures had begun to evaporate. Farewell events and speaking appearances were described as disappearing, institutions allegedly reconsidered ceremonial honors, and the Pelosi name, once presented as political currency in California, was recast as a liability nobody wanted attached to them. The script's message was deliberately ruthless. Power attracts allies while it is useful, but the moment the receipts become dangerous, the same people who once stood nearby suddenly discover the strategic value of distance. 6 weeks after the hearing, the script claims that federal agents entered the offices of financial leasing services in San Francisco, carrying away boxes, hard drives, and business records while Paul Pelosi's trading accounts were frozen by court order. His former broker was portrayed as cooperating with prosecutors and describing unusual instructions involving the timing of certain transactions, while Paul Pelosi Jr. and companies connected to his business career were pulled into a wider investigation. Former associates allegedly began cooperating. Subpoenas expanded, and the case that Kennedy had framed in terms of congressional ethics was recast as a sprawling inquiry into whether access, family business, and legislative timing had intersected in ways the law could punish. 4 months after the hearing, the script goes even further, describing a 47-count federal indictment against Nancy and Paul Pelosi involving securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, false statements, tax offenses, obstruction, and alleged Stock Act violations. Bail, surrendered passports, frozen accounts, and a public trial were all presented as the inevitable collapse of a system that Kennedy had supposedly exposed with nothing more theatrical than a binder and a legal pad. The trial section of the script repeats the pattern established in the hearing, only now in a courtroom, with prosecutors allegedly presenting 47 trades across 15 years and arguing that many were positioned suspiciously close to legislative actions Nancy Pelosi controlled or influenced. A forensic financial expert was said to have calculated that the odds of the trading pattern occurring by chance were roughly 1 in 47 million, while a former senior Pelosi staffer allegedly testified that legislative timing was discussed during personal calls between Nancy and Paul Pelosi. The defense in the script argued investment skill and legitimate market judgment, but the jury rejected enough of that explanation to return guilty verdicts on 38 of 47 counts. The sentencing judge is then portrayed as condemning the use of public trust as a private trading advantage while ordinary constituents struggled with the cost of living, reducing decades of political status to a courtroom judgment about abuse of power. Nancy Pelosi is sentenced in the narrative to 7 years in federal prison and tens of millions of dollars in penalties, Paul Pelosi to 5 years and additional fines, with both appeals later denied. The script then turns the personal collapse into a legislative legacy, claiming that Congress passed a comprehensive stock trading ban for members and spouses 6 months later, prohibiting individual stock trades while in office and attracting bipartisan support. Conservatives in the narrative called it the Pelosi Act, creating the final irony around the woman whose earlier defense of a free market economy had become one of the central lines Kennedy used against her. Her name, under that framing, was no longer attached only to decades of leadership, major legislation, and congressional history, but also to the rule designed to prevent lawmakers and their families from making the kind of trades that had fueled the controversy in the first place. Kennedy's Louisiana approval rating was said to rise sharply. Law schools allegedly began studying the hearing as an example of legislative cross-examination, and business schools treated the exchange as a case study in how preparation can overwhelm political performance. Kennedy himself, consistent with the script's characterization, refused to dramatize his role and reduced everything to the idea that he had simply asked questions any taxpayer had the right to ask. The final return to Margaret Chin gives the script its closing moral frame, bringing the argument back from hundreds of millions of dollars, congressional power, indictments, and financial disclosures to a former flower shop owner sitting quietly in San Francisco. She watches the sentencing on television, no longer running the business she had operated for more than 2 decades, and she does not celebrate because the point of her role in the script is not revenge but recognition. She tells her daughter that she had voted for Pelosi for 40 years and that, in the end, a senator from Louisiana appeared more interested in what happened to her flower shop than the politician she had supported election after election. The narrator then closes by returning to the central contrast that drove the entire script from the beginning. Pelosi arrived prepared to lecture Kennedy, Kennedy arrived with receipts, and only one of them remained in control of the room when the question stopped being theoretical. The final message is unapologetically severe. Public servants can explain away individual coincidences for years, but once people start comparing the rules, the money, the timing, and the outcomes, rhetoric eventually runs out of room and the arithmetic keeps sitting there.